The morning sun cast long shadows across the military air base as Elena Petrov stood before the recruitment panel, her heart pounding against her ribs. At barely 5 feet tall, with delicate hands that could span less than 7 inches, she looked, nothing like the towering male pilots who had walked through these doors before her. The year was 1941 and the world was at war. But the Soviet Union's aviation program had never seriously considered women as combat pilots. "Your hands are too small to properly grip the controls during high-speed maneuvers," announced Colonel Dmitry Volkov, the chief flight instructor, without even looking up from his paperwork. His weathered fingers drummed against the wooden desk. As he continued, "The G-forces alone would make it impossible for someone of your stature to maintain control of a fighter aircraft." Elena's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Sir, I've been flying civilian aircraft since I was 16. I understand the mechanics of flight better than most of your current cadets." She had spent countless hours in crop dusters and mail planes, learning every nuance of aerodynamics from her father, a former Imperial Russian Air Service pilot who had survived the Great War. The panel exchanged knowing glances. Major Sergei Antonov, a decorated ace with 12 confirmed kills, leaned forward with a condescending smile. "Young lady, there's a significant difference between puttering around in a training plane and engaging enemy fighters at 400 miles per hour while bullets tear through your cockpit. The physical demands alone would overwhelm you. I've studied combat tactics, sir. I know the Messerschmitt 109's weaknesses, the optimal attack angles for the Junkers 88, and I can field strip and rebuild a Shvetsov engine blindfolded." Elena's voice grew stronger with each word, her passion evident despite her professional demeanor. Colonel Volkov finally raised his eyes, studying her with the same expression he might reserve for an interesting but ultimately useless curiosity. "Miss Petrov, your enthusiasm is admirable, but this is not a classroom exercise. In aerial combat, split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death. The enemy won't hesitate to kill you simply because you're a woman." The rejection felt like a physical blow, but Elena had expected it. She had watched her male counterparts breeze through the application process while she faced scrutiny over every qualification. Her flight logs showed more hours than half the accepted candidates. Her written examinations scored higher than 70% of the current pilot class. Yet here she stood, being dismissed because of her gender and physical stature. "Furthermore," added Major Antonov, shuffling through her documents, "our aircraft are designed for male pilots. The seat configurations, control placements, and even the oxygen systems are calibrated for larger frames. Modifying equipment for one candidate would be impractical and potentially dangerous." As Elena walked away from the recruitment center, her rejection letter clutched in her trembling hands. She felt the weight of generations of women who had been told they weren't strong enough, smart enough, or capable enough. But something burned within her chest that wouldn't be extinguished by bureaucratic dismissal. That evening, she sat in her father's workshop, surrounded by engine parts and aviation manuals. "They say my hands are too small," she told him, flexing, her fingers around a wrench. "They say I can't handle the physical demands." Her father, Viktor Petrov, looked up from the radial engine he was rebuilding. His own hands bore the scars of countless repairs and the tremor that came from years of high-altitude flying. "Elena, I've watched you work on these engines since you were tall enough to reach the workbench. I've seen you compensate for your size with technique, precision, and intelligence. Sometimes the smallest hands can reach places others cannot." He pulled out a faded photograph of himself standing beside a Newport fighter from 1917. "During the last war, they told us many things were impossible, that heavier-than-air machines would never fly in combat, that aerial warfare was a fantasy, that pilots were unnecessary luxuries. Yet here we are, 24 years later, and the sky has become the ultimate battlefield." Elena studied the photograph, seeing something in her father's young face that mirrored her own determination. What did you do when they told you it was impossible? I proved them wrong, Victor said simply. But more importantly, I waited for my moment. Sometimes the world needs to be desperate enough to abandon its prejudices. As news of the German advance reached their small town, Elena realized that moment might be approaching sooner than anyone expected. The Soviet Air Force was losing pilots faster than they could train replacements, and desperate times often called for desperate measures. She spent the following weeks intensifying her training, pushing herself harder than ever before. Every morning before dawn, she was in the air, practicing combat maneuvers in her father's old biplane. She studied enemy aircraft recognition until she could identify a fighter's nationality and model from silhouette alone. She strengthened her hands and arms, knowing that if she ever got another chance, she would need every advantage possible. The rejection had stung, but it had also crystallized her resolve. Elena Petrov would become a fighter pilot, regardless of what the military establishment believed about women in combat. She just needed to wait for the right opportunity to prove that skill and determination mattered more than size and gender. 6 months after Elena's rejection, the war had transformed from a distant rumble to a devastating reality that consumed everything in its path. German forces had advanced deep into Soviet territory, and the Luftwaffe controlled vast stretches of sky that had once belonged to the Red Air Force. Pilot casualties mounted daily, and the once selective recruitment standards began to crack under the pressure of desperate necessity. Marina Raskova, the Soviet Union's most celebrated female aviator, had been quietly lobbying Stalin for permission to form all-female aviation regiments. Her arguments were practical rather than ideological. Women could free up men for ground combat. They required less food and fuel, and many already possessed valuable technical skills from working in aircraft factories. When the proposal finally reached Stalin's desk in October 1941, the situation had become dire enough for him to approve what would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Elena learned about the new opportunity through her friend Katya, who worked in the communications office at the regional military headquarters. "They're accepting women now," Katya whispered during their weekly meeting at the local market. "Not just as mechanics or radio operators, but as pilots. Real combat pilots." The news sent electricity through Elena's entire body. After months of watching male pilots disappear into the grinding machinery of warfare, often returning as casualty reports or not returning at all, she finally had another chance. But this time would be different. The military's desperation meant they needed every capable pilot, regardless of preconceived notions about gender or physical limitations. Elena's second application process took place in a hastily converted gymnasium in Moscow, where hundreds of women from across the Soviet Union had gathered. The atmosphere was electric with possibility and determination. These women came from every walk of life: factory workers who had learned to fly through aviation clubs, school teachers who had studied aeronautics, farm girls who had grown up around aircraft, and university students with engineering degrees. The testing was more rigorous than anything Elena had experienced before. Physical fitness examinations pushed every candidate to their limits, while written tests covered everything from advanced mathematics to enemy aircraft identification. The flight evaluations were conducted in harsh conditions, with instructors deliberately creating stressful situations to test each woman's ability to remain calm under pressure. Elena's small size, once considered a liability, suddenly became an advantage. She could fit comfortably in cockpits that cramped larger pilots, and her delicate hands proved surprisingly adept at the precise control movements required for advanced aerobatics. During one particularly challenging evaluation, she executed a perfect split-S maneuver while maintaining formation with 2 other aircraft, something that impressed even the most skeptical instructors. "Petrov," called out Captain Yelena Starshinova, one of the few female flight instructors in the Soviet Air Force, "your technical knowledge is exceptional, and your flying skills are above average. But combat aviation is different from anything you've experienced. Are you prepared for the psychological stress of trying to kill another human being while they simultaneously attempt to kill you? Elena met the captain's gaze without flinching. Ma'am, I've watched German bombers destroy everything I care about. I've seen what happens when good people can't defend themselves. I'm not seeking glory or adventure. I want to protect my country and my family, and I'll do whatever that requires. The training program was intense beyond anything Elena had imagined. Days began at 4 in the morning with physical conditioning that left even the strongest women exhausted. Classroom instruction covered advanced tactics, enemy capabilities, weather navigation, and emergency procedures. Flight training progressed from basic maneuvers to complex combat scenarios, with instructors constantly pushing candidates to their breaking points. Many women dropped out during the first month. The combination of physical demands, technical complexity, and psychological pressure proved too much for those who weren't absolutely committed. Elena watched promising pilots wash out because they couldn't adapt to the demanding schedule or couldn't master the split-second decision-making required in aerial combat. But Elena thrived in the demanding environment. Her years of self-directed study had prepared her for the technical aspects, while her father's training had given her a foundation in practical aviation that many other candidates lacked. She quickly distinguished herself as one of the program's most capable students, earning respect from both instructors and fellow trainees. The breakthrough moment came during a simulated combat exercise in February 1942. Elena was assigned to fly against Captain Vladimir Komarov, an experienced male pilot who had volunteered to help train the women's regiment. Komarov was known for his aggressive tactics and his skepticism about female combat pilots, making him a perfect test of Elena's abilities. The engagement began with both aircraft climbing to 15,000 feet above the snow-covered training grounds. Komarov immediately attempted to use his superior physical strength to his advantage, pulling high G maneuvers designed to overwhelm Elena's smaller frame. But Elena had anticipated this strategy, using her aircraft's lighter weight and more precise control inputs to maintain position while conserving energy. For 10 minutes, the two pilots engaged in an intricate aerial dance, each seeking the perfect shot position while avoiding their opponent's guns. Elena used every trick her father had taught her, combined with tactics she had studied from German and British combat reports. She waited patiently, allowing Komarov to exhaust himself with dramatic maneuvers while she maintained steady pressure. The decisive moment came when Komarov attempted a climbing spiral that would have given him a perfect shooting position. Elena recognized the maneuver from her studies and executed a perfectly timed reversal, using her smaller aircraft's superior turning radius to slip inside Komarov's turn. Within seconds, she had achieved the killing position behind his aircraft. "Guns! Guns! Guns!" Elena called over the radio, indicating a successful attack in the training exercise. Below them, ground observers confirmed that she had maintained the attack position for the required 3 seconds, achieving a definitive victory against one of the unit's most experienced pilots. After landing, Captain Komarov approached Elena's aircraft with a mixture of surprise and respect. "That was expertly flown," he admitted, removing his flight helmet. "I underestimated your tactical awareness and overestimated the importance of physical strength in aerial combat. Perhaps these small hands of yours are exactly what our Air Force needs." Word of Elena's victory spread quickly through the training program, earning her the nickname Malenkaya Yastreb, or Little Hawk. More importantly, it proved to the remaining skeptics that women could not only survive aerial combat, but excel at it. Elena had found her place in the war, and soon she would have the opportunity to prove herself against real enemies in real combat. The spring of 1942 brought Elena to the front lines of the Eastern Front, where the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had been deployed to support Soviet ground forces near Stalingrad. The regiment, composed entirely of women, flew outdated Polikarpov, Po-2 biplanes that were barely faster than the automobiles racing on pre-war highways. These fabric-covered aircraft, originally designed for training and crop dusting, had been hastily converted into night bombers through the simple addition of bomb racks beneath their wings. Elena's first combat mission came on a moonless April, night when German forces had established a heavily fortified position blocking the Soviet advance. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy supply convoys used the cover of darkness to resupply their positions, making them vulnerable to surprise attacks from low-flying aircraft. The mission was considered routine harassment rather than decisive combat, perfectly suited to the PO-2's limited capabilities. "Remember, we're gnats annoying elephants," explained Major Yevgenia Zhigulenko during the pre-flight briefing. "We can't destroy their entire army, but we can make them lose sleep, waste ammunition, and constantly worry about when we might appear. Psychological warfare is just as important as destroying equipment." Elena climbed into her aircraft alongside. Navigator Lieutenant Olga Lisitsina, a former school teacher who had learned aerial navigation through correspondence courses. The Po-2's open cockpit provided no protection from the bitter wind and sub-zero temperatures, forcing both women to wear bulky sheepskin flying suits that made precise control movements difficult. The aircraft's primitive instrumentation consisted of basic altitude and airspeed indicators, requiring pilots to navigate primarily through visual references and dead reckoning. As they approached the German lines, Elena could see searchlights, sweeping the sky like giant fingers probing for intruders. Anti-aircraft guns began firing blindly into the darkness, creating spectacular fireworks displays that were beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. The PO-2's fabric construction made it nearly invisible to German radar systems, but it also meant that a single machine gun bullet could cause catastrophic damage. "Target ahead," whispered Olga through the speaking tube that connected their cockpits. "Truck convoy approximately 2 kilometers northeast. Count 12 vehicles, probably carrying ammunition or fuel." Elena began her attack approach, throttling back the engine until it barely whispered through the night air. The Po-2's incredibly slow speed, normally considered a disadvantage, became an asset during precision bombing runs. She could practically hover over targets while lining up perfect attack angles, something faster aircraft couldn't accomplish. The first bomb struck directly between two trucks, creating a massive explosion that illuminated the entire convoy. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition and fuel caught fire, turning the supply run into a spectacular disaster. Elena banked sharply to avoid the rising flames, while Olga prepared their remaining bombs for a second pass. "Searchlights have us," Olga called out as brilliant beams began tracking their aircraft. "Machine gun fire from the northeast, range approximately 800 meters. Tracers began streaming past their wings like deadly fireflies, some passing close enough for Elena to feel the heat from their passage. Elena threw the Po-2 into a series of gentle turns and climbs that kept them just outside the searchlight beams while positioning for their second attack. The aircraft's incredible maneuverability allowed her to change direction almost instantly, making it nearly impossible for ground gunners to predict her movements. She had learned to use the PO-2's limitations as tactical advantages, flying lower and slower than enemy gunners expected. The second bombing run targeted a German headquarters building identified by its distinctive radio antennas and the activity surrounding it. Elena approached from the east, using a line of trees to mask their approach until they were directly overhead. The bombs struck with devastating accuracy, destroying the building and presumably eliminating important communication equipment. But as they turned for home, disaster struck. A lucky shot from a German machine gun punched through the Po-2's engine compartment, causing the motor to cough, sputter, and begin losing power. Oil pressure dropped rapidly while engine temperature climbed toward dangerous levels. They were still 20 kilometers behind enemy lines with a dying aircraft and limited altitude for emergency maneuvering. "Engines finished," Elena told Olga, calmly, though her heart was racing. "We need to find somewhere to land before it seizes completely." She began scanning the landscape below, looking for any flat area that might accommodate an emergency landing. Olga consulted her maps by flashlight, cross-referencing their position with known friendly forces. There's a Soviet outpost approximately 15 kilometers southwest, but I'm not certain we can maintain altitude that long. Elena nursed the failing engine with delicate throttle control, balancing power output against mechanical stress. The Po-2 began descending gradually, losing precious altitude with each passing minute. Below them, German positions continued firing sporadically, unaware that they had already achieved their objective. "Farm field ahead," Elena announced as she spotted a relatively flat area between two villages. "Not ideal, but it's our best option." She set up for an approach that would bring them down short of the German positions while avoiding the worst obstacles. The landing was controlled but violent, with the Po-2 bouncing twice before settling into a skidding halt that bent the landing, gear and tore fabric from both wings. Both women were thrown forward against their restraints, but neither was seriously injured. Within seconds of stopping, they were out of the aircraft and running toward the tree line, knowing that German patrols would investigate the crash site. For 3 days, Elena and Olga evaded enemy search parties while making their way back to Soviet lines. They traveled only at night, hiding in abandoned buildings and farm outhouses during daylight hours. Elena's survival training proved invaluable as she led them through enemy territory using navigation techniques learned from her father. When they finally reached friendly positions, both women were exhausted, hungry, and suffering from exposure, but their debriefing revealed that their mission had been more successful than anticipated. German radio intercepts indicated that their attack had destroyed a critical ammunition supply and eliminated a divisional communication center, disrupting enemy operations for several days. "Not bad for your first combat mission," Major Zhigolenko commented as Elena completed her report. "Though I suspect you're ready for something more challenging than harassment bombing." Elena looked up from her paperwork, meeting her commander's knowing smile. "Ma'am, I joined this program to fight, not just to annoy the enemy. If there are more demanding missions available, I'd be honored to volunteer." Within a week, Elena received orders transferring her to the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, where she would transition from the gentle Po-2 to the high-performance Yakovlev Yak-1 fighter. Her combat career was about to enter an entirely new phase, one that would test every skill she had developed and some she hadn't yet discovered. The transition from the docile Po-2 to the aggressive Yakovlev Yak-1 fighter was like stepping from a gentle horse to a wild stallion. The Yak-1 possessed 10 times the horsepower of Elena's previous aircraft, could reach speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, and carried 2 devastating Schwack cannons capable of destroying enemy fighters with a single well-placed burst. But with this performance came complexity and danger that demanded absolute precision from its pilot. Elena's checkout training took place at a converted airfield outside Moscow during the summer of 1942, where experienced male pilots grudgingly taught the fundamentals of high-performance fighter operations. The aircraft's cockpit was cramped even by wartime standards, with instruments packed so tightly that larger pilots struggled to read them clearly. For Elena, however, the compact layout felt natural, allowing her to monitor all systems without the excessive head movement that could prove fatal during combat maneuvering. "The Yak will kill you faster than any German if you don't respect it," warned Captain Boris Arameev during Elena's first ground instruction session. "It has no patience for sloppy flying, poor judgment, or hesitation. Every control input must be deliberate and precise, or you'll find yourself in an unrecoverable situation." Elena's first solo flight in the Yak-1 was both exhilarating and terrifying. The aircraft leaped off the runway with barely 200 meters of ground roll, climbing at angles that would have been impossible in her previous aircraft. The engine's roar filled the cockpit with sound and vibration, while the slipstream created turbulence that demanded constant attention to maintain level flight. But as the days progressed, Elena began to understand the fighter's personality. The Yak-1 responded to smooth, confident inputs with crisp performance, rewarding skilled pilots with maneuverability that could match anything the Germans fielded. Elena's small hands, once considered a liability, proved perfectly suited to the aircraft's sensitive controls, allowing her to make micro-adjustments that larger pilots couldn't duplicate. Advanced training covered aerial gunnery, formation flying, and combat tactics against various enemy aircraft types. Elena spent hours in classroom sessions studying the performance characteristics of German fighters, learning their strengths and vulnerabilities, and memorizing the optimal attack approaches. For different combat scenarios, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's primary fighter, was faster than the Yak-1 in level flight, but less maneuverable at low speeds. The Focke-Wulf 190 possessed superior firepower but couldn't match the Soviet fighter's climb rate. Remember, instructed Major Alexander Pokrishkin, a leading ace who occasionally visited the training program, aerial combat is chess played at 400 miles per hour. Every move must be calculated 3 steps ahead, and the pilot who hesitates dies. Your aircraft is simply a tool. Victory depends on the intelligence and determination of the person controlling it. Elena's gunnery training revealed another advantage of her physical characteristics. The Yak-1's cannon created significant recoil that could throw off a pilot's aim during extended firing sequences. Elena's lighter weight meant less momentum to overcome when correcting for recoil, allowing her to maintain accurate fire longer than heavier pilots. Her scores consistently ranked among the top 5% of students, earning recognition from instructors who had initially doubted women's suitability for fighter operations. By September 1942, Elena had been assigned to the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment and deployed to an advance airfield near Stalingrad, where Soviet and German forces were locked in a brutal urban warfare campaign. The regiment's mission was to provide air cover for ground attack aircraft and to intercept German bombers targeting Soviet supply lines. Elena's first fighter combat occurred on a gray October morning when German Junkers Ju-88 bombers approached, Soviet positions escorted by 4 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. Elena was flying as wingman to Captain Tamara Kazarinova, an experienced pilot with 6 confirmed victories who served as Elena's combat mentor. "Remember your training," Kazarinova radioed as they climbed to intercept altitude. "Stay close, watch my movements, and don't get fixated on any single target. The moment you stop thinking about everything else in the sky is the moment someone shoots you down." The engagement began at 12,000 feet, when the Soviet fighters dove on the German formation. From above and behind, using altitude advantage to achieve surprise. Elena watched Kazarinova select the trailing Bf 109 as her target, then followed her leader through a high-speed diving attack that brought them within cannon range in seconds. Elena's first shots missed, her excitement causing her to fire from too great a distance. But she had learned from countless training exercises, and her second burst caught the German fighter's wing root, sending metal fragments spinning away into the slipstream. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove toward the ground, trailing black smoke from its damaged engine. "Good shooting," Kazarinova called over the radio. "Now let's see if you can do it again." The aerial battle continued for 15 minutes, as the remaining aircraft maneuvered for advantage in 3-dimensional space. Elena found herself separated from her leader during a particularly violent engagement sequence, facing a lone German pilot who had similar ideas about achieving an easy victory against an inexperienced opponent. The German pilot was skilled and aggressive, using his aircraft's superior speed to maintain energy advantage while attempting to force Elena into a turning fight where his experience might prove decisive. But Elena remembered her training and her father's lessons about patience and timing. Instead of accepting the Germans' preferred combat style, she used the Yak-1's superior climbing ability to force a vertical engagement. For several minutes, the 2 fighters climbed in spiraling helixes, each pilot seeking the perfect moment to reverse direction and achieve a killing shot. Elena's smaller size became crucial as G-forces built during the tight maneuvering, allowing her to remain conscious and alert while her opponent struggled against the physical stress. The decisive moment came when the German pilot made a slight error in energy management, allowing his aircraft to lose just enough speed for Elena to complete a vertical reversal that placed her directly behind his fighter. Her cannon burst was perfectly aimed, striking the Messerschmitt's cockpit and engine simultaneously. The German aircraft disintegrated in a spectacular explosion that sent debris cascading toward the battlefield below. Elena's hands were trembling as she landed back at base, the reality of aerial combat finally sinking in. She had just killed another human being, a skilled pilot who had probably been someone's son, husband, or father. The victory felt hollow despite its tactical importance, but Elena understood that such feelings were a luxury she couldn't afford while her country faced extinction. "How do you handle it?" she asked Kazarinova later that evening as they reviewed the day's mission. "The knowledge that every victory means someone dies?" Kazarinova looked up from her logbook, her expression serious but not unkind. "You remember why you're fighting," she said simply. "Every German bomber you shoot down can't drop bombs on Soviet cities. Every fighter you destroy can't shoot down our ground attack aircraft. War is terrible, but losing this war would be worse." That night, Elena wrote in her personal diary, "Today I became a killer. I pray that someday I can return to being simply a pilot. But until then, I will do whatever my country requires." She had crossed a threshold that separated her forever from the civilian world. But she had also proven that determination and skill mattered more than physical size or gender stereotypes. Winter came early to the Stalingrad front in 1942, bringing brutal cold that froze aircraft engines and made metal components so brittle they could shatter from thermal shock. Elena had now been flying combat missions for 3 months, accumulating 7 confirmed victories and a reputation among both Soviet and German pilots as a formidable opponent. Her small hands, once dismissed as inadequate for fighter aircraft, had become legendary for their precision during high-speed combat maneuvering. The German Luftwaffe had learned to recognize Elena's distinctive flying style and had begun assigning their most experienced pilots to hunt specifically for the Little Hawk, who had become a significant threat to their bomber formations. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans had placed a substantial bounty on her capture or elimination, treating her as a high-value target worthy of special attention. Elena's growing reputation brought both advantages and dangers. Soviet ground forces had learned to expect effective air cover when her squadron was overhead, boosting morale among troops who had previously felt abandoned by their own air force. But the increased attention also meant that every mission now carried the risk of facing multiple experienced enemy pilots who had studied her tactics and were prepared for her preferred combat methods. The transformation in Elena's flying during those winter months was remarkable to observe. Captain Kazarinova, now promoted to squadron commander, noted in her reports that Elena had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate enemy movements and position her aircraft for optimal attack opportunities. Her gunnery accuracy had improved to the point where she rarely required more than a 2-second burst to destroy enemy aircraft. "She's become something different from the rest of us," Kazarinova confided to Major Pokrishkin during one of his inspection visits. "Not just technically skilled, but tactically innovative. She's developed attack methods that shouldn't work according to conventional wisdom, but they're devastatingly effective against experienced German pilots." Elena's tactical innovations stemmed partly from necessity and partly from her unique perspective as a small person flying in combat designed for larger individuals. She had learned to use her aircraft's lighter weight distribution to achieve turning radii that other pilots couldn't match, allowing her to reverse direction in impossibly tight spaces. Her precise control inputs enabled her to fly in formation closer than safety regulations recommended, making it difficult for enemies to engage one Soviet fighter without exposing themselves to attack from her wingmates. The breakthrough that would define Elena's reputation came during a massive air battle on December 15th, when German forces launched a coordinated offensive designed to break the Soviet siege of Stalingrad. Intelligence reports indicated that over 200 German aircraft would participate in the assault, including their newest fighter types and most experienced pilots transferred from other fronts specifically for this operation. Elena's squadron was assigned to intercept German dive bombers targeting Soviet tank formations, a mission that required them to fight through multiple layers of fighter escorts to reach their primary targets. The odds were overwhelming: 12 Soviet fighters against an estimated 60 German aircraft of various types, but the ground situation was so desperate that every available pilot was committed regardless of tactical feasibility. The engagement began at dawn when Elena spotted the incoming German formation silhouetted against the morning sky. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Dozens of aircraft arranged in perfect combat formations, representing thousands of hours of training, and millions of rubles worth of military equipment, all focused on destroying Soviet ground forces. "This is it," Elena radioed to her squadron mates. "Everything we've trained for comes down to the next 30 minutes. Stay close, watch each other's backs, and remember that our soldiers are counting on us." The initial contact occurred at 15,000 feet when Elena's squadron dove through the German fighter screen, hoping to reach the bombers before the escorts could react effectively. Elena selected a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber as her primary target, approaching from below and behind to avoid the aircraft's defensive gunner. Her first attack was perfectly executed, with cannon shells striking the Stuka's engine and cockpit simultaneously. The dive bomber rolled over and plummeted toward the ground, trailing smoke and flame. But before Elena could select another target, she found herself surrounded by 4 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters whose pilots had clearly been briefed about her capabilities and weaknesses. What followed was the most intense aerial combat of Elena's career. For 20 minutes, she engaged in a constantly shifting three-dimensional battle that tested every skill she had developed. The German pilots were exceptionally skilled and coordinated, using textbook tactics designed to overwhelm a single fighter through superior numbers and positioning. Elena survived the encounter through a combination of tactical innovation, precise flying, and extraordinary situational awareness. She used the battlefield itself as cover, diving through smoke columns and weaving between burning vehicles to break visual contact with pursuing fighters. Her small size allowed her to execute maneuvers in spaces where larger pilots couldn't follow, turning the apparent disadvantage of her stature into a decisive tactical advantage. During the engagement, Elena managed to destroy 3 additional German fighters through carefully planned attacks that used her superior maneuverability to achieve brief firing opportunities. Each victory was achieved through patient maneuvering and precise gunnery rather than spectacular aerobatics, demonstrating the maturity her combat skills had achieved. But the most remarkable aspect of the battle was Elena's ability to maintain awareness of the larger tactical situation while engaged in individual combat. She continued to coordinate with her squadron mates via radio, providing warnings about enemy positions and organizing defensive maneuvers that prevented several Soviet pilots from being shot down. When the battle finally ended, Elena's squadron had achieved an unprecedented victory ratio: 7 German aircraft destroyed against the loss of only 1 Soviet fighter. Elena personally accounted for 4 of those victories, bringing her total to 11 confirmed kills and establishing her as one of the Soviet Union's leading fighter aces. The aftermath of the battle brought Elena to the attention of the highest levels of Soviet military leadership. Marshal of Aviation Alexander Novikov personally reviewed her combat reports and recommended her for immediate promotion and decoration. More importantly, her tactical innovations during the engagement were incorporated into new training curricula for Soviet fighter pilots. Comrade Petrov has demonstrated that technical skill and tactical intelligence can overcome apparent physical limitations, Novikov wrote in his assessment. Her methods should be studied and adapted by other pilots, particularly those who may lack the physical advantages traditionally associated with fighter aviation. That evening, as Elena sat in her quarters cleaning her flight gear and updating her logbook, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from rejected applicant to respected combat veteran. The hands that military officials had once deemed too small were now steady enough to place cannon shells within centimeters of their intended targets. The stature that had been considered inadequate for fighter operations had proven perfectly suited to the demands of aerial combat. Elena had become exactly what she had always insisted she could be: a skilled fighter pilot whose achievements were measured not by physical characteristics, but by results in combat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that determination and intelligence mattered more than conventional expectations about who could succeed in warfare. January 18th, 1943, dawned gray and bitter cold over the Stalingrad battlefield, with temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius and visibility limited by blowing snow. Elena had been flying combat missions for 8 months now, with 11 confirmed victories, making her one of the Soviet Union's most successful female fighter pilots. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the mission briefing that morning, which would either cement her legacy or end her life. In spectacular fashion, intelligence reports indicated that German forces were planning a massive aerial offensive designed to break Soviet supply lines and provide air support for a final ground assault on Soviet positions. The operation involved over 150 German aircraft, including their newest fighter variants and most experienced bomber crews. More concerning was the intelligence suggesting that several German aces had been specifically assigned to eliminate high-value Soviet pilots, with Elena's name reportedly appearing on their target lists. "The situation is critical," announced Colonel Mikhail Baranov during the pre-dawn briefing. "German ground forces are preparing for what may be their final attempt to capture Stalingrad, and they're concentrating everything they have for this offensive. Our mission is to disrupt their air support operations, but frankly, the odds are overwhelming." Elena studied the intelligence photographs showing massive German aircraft formations assembled at nearby airfields. The numbers were staggering. Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, Focke-Wulf 190 ground attack aircraft, Junkers Ju 88 bombers, and Heinkel He 111 heavy bombers, all prepared for coordinated operations against Soviet positions. Her squadron of 8 operational aircraft would be facing odds of nearly 20 to 1. "Ma'am," Elena addressed Colonel Baranov, "what are our rules of engagement? Are we primarily tasked with bomber interception, or should we engage fighters of opportunity?" Baranov looked at her with the expression of a commander who was sending his best pilots on what might be a suicide mission. "Comrade Petrov, your objective is to cause maximum disruption to German operations using whatever methods you judge most effective. You have complete tactical freedom to engage targets as opportunities present themselves." Elena's new aircraft for this mission was a recently delivered Yakovlev Yak-9, an improved version of her previous fighter with better high-altitude performance and increased ammunition capacity. The aircraft had been specially modified with additional fuel tanks that would allow extended operations, though the extra weight would affect maneuverability until the fuel was consumed during combat. As the Soviet fighters climbed toward their patrol altitude, Elena could see the massive German formation approaching from the west. The sight was simultaneously terrifying and inspiring. Hundreds of aircraft arranged in perfect combat formations, representing the pinnacle of German aviation technology and training. This would be aerial warfare on a scale rarely seen, even during the most intense periods of the conflict. The engagement began when Elena's squadron intercepted a formation of Junkers Ju 88 bombers, escorted by 12 Messerschmitt fighters. Elena immediately recognized that conventional tactics would be suicidal against such overwhelming numbers, so she decided to use the one advantage her small squadron possessed: unpredictability and individual pilot skill. Break formation and engage independently. Elena radioed to her squadron mates. Use hit-and-run tactics, avoid prolonged engagements, and remember that every bomber we stop saves Soviet lives on the ground. Elena's first attack targeted the lead bomber in the German formation, approaching from directly ahead in a head-on pass that gave the enemy gunners minimal time to track her aircraft. Her cannon burst was perfectly timed, striking the Junker's cockpit and nose section simultaneously. The bomber exploded in a spectacular fireball that scattered burning debris across several square kilometers. But before Elena could celebrate her victory, she found herself under attack by 3 German fighters whose pilots had clearly been briefed about her capabilities. The ensuing combat was unlike anything she had previously experienced, with multiple opponents coordinating their attacks to overwhelm her defensive options. Elena's response was to use every tactical innovation she had developed during months of combat experience. She flew lower than the German pilots expected, using ground terrain to mask her movements and break visual contact during critical moments. Her precise control inputs allowed her to execute maneuvers in spaces where larger pilots couldn't follow, turning apparent disadvantages into tactical opportunities. Over the next 45 minutes, Elena engaged in the most intense aerial combat of her career. She destroyed 2 Messerschmitt fighters through carefully planned attacks that used superior maneuverability to achieve brief firing opportunities. A Focke-Wulf 190 fell to her guns after she executed a vertical climbing attack that the German pilot couldn't match. 3 more Junkers bombers were destroyed through patient stalking and precision gunnery. The remarkable aspect of Elena's performance was her ability to maintain tactical awareness while engaged in individual combat. She continued to coordinate with surviving squadron mates, providing warnings about enemy positions and organizing defensive maneuvers. Her radio calls guided other Soviet pilots to successful attacks while helping them avoid potentially fatal situations. As the battle progressed, Elena found herself increasingly isolated from friendly aircraft, but surrounded by growing numbers of German fighters drawn by reports of her success. What followed was a running battle across 50 kilometers of airspace, with Elena using every skill she had developed to survive against overwhelming odds. The decisive phase of the engagement occurred when Elena encountered a formation of 4 Heinkel He-111 heavy bombers approaching Soviet tank positions. These aircraft represented the greatest threat to ground forces, and Elena knew that destroying them would justify the risks of the entire mission. Elena's attacks on the Heinkel formation demonstrated the pinnacle of her combat skills. She approached from multiple angles, using the bombers' defensive blind spots to achieve killing positions while avoiding their concentrated defensive fire. Each attack was precisely calculated to maximize damage while minimizing her exposure to enemy guns. The first Heinkel disintegrated when Elena's cannon shells ignited its bomb load, creating an explosion visible from ground positions 20 kilometers away. The second bomber fell after Elena systematically destroyed its engines through repeated attacks from different angles. The third Heinkel crashed after Elena's precise gunnery eliminated its entire crew, leaving the aircraft to spiral uncontrolled into the ground. The fourth bomber presented Elena's greatest challenge, as its pilot was clearly experienced and was using evasive maneuvers to complicate her attack approaches. Elena stalked the Heinkel for several minutes, waiting for the perfect opportunity while avoiding defensive fire from the aircraft's multiple gun positions. The killing shot came when Elena executed a climbing attack from directly below the bomber, a position that minimized her exposure to defensive guns while providing a clear shot at the aircraft's fuel tanks. Her cannon burst was perfectly aimed, igniting the bomber's fuel system and creating another spectacular explosion. When Elena finally returned to base, her aircraft was riddled with bullet holes and running on fumes. Ground crews counted over 30 separate impact points on her fighter, any one of which could have caused catastrophic damage. But Elena had survived the most intense aerial combat of the war and achieved results that seemed impossible. Her final tally for the mission was 12 confirmed victories, 4 Messerschmitt fighters, 1 Focke-Wulf ground attack aircraft, 4 Junkers bombers, and 3 Heinkel heavy bombers. This single sortie had made Elena the highest-scoring female fighter pilot in history and one of the most successful Soviet aces regardless of gender. The aftermath of Elena's record-breaking mission sent shockwaves through both Soviet and German military establishments. Soviet propaganda celebrated her achievements as proof of their pilot's superiority, while German intelligence began developing new tactics specifically designed to counter her methods. Elena's personal reaction was characteristically modest. "I was simply doing my job," she told reporters who flocked to interview the pilot, whose small hands had been deemed inadequate for fighter aircraft. "Every victory today means that Soviet soldiers on the ground have a better chance of surviving until tomorrow." But privately, Elena understood the significance of what she had accomplished. In a single mission, she had proven conclusively that skill, determination, and tactical intelligence mattered more than physical characteristics or gender stereotypes. The hands that had been rejected as too small had achieved precision that larger pilots couldn't match. Elena Petrov had become exactly what she always insisted she could be: a fighter pilot whose achievements were measured not by physical attributes, but by results in combat. Her legacy would inspire future generations of women who faced similar dismissals of their capabilities, proving that determination and excellence could overcome any prejudice.